Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a real honor and a privilege on behalf of Colorado Preservation Inc. to come to you and to talk a little bit about some of the successes and challenges we've had doing this work over 25 years in the state of Colorado. But I'm also going to speak a little more broadly about preservation in general around the state and outside of our program, as well as the work of other organizations. So what I'd like to do is start broadly and talk about some basic notions of historic preservation, what it is and what it isn't, and also touch briefly on the approaches that are taken to the preservation of individual buildings and resources, so that we all have kind of the same vocabulary and talking about the same things. And then I will talk about the Endangered Places program. And this is I'm starting my 5th year in the program. And it's a very challenging program working around the state of Colorado. There's a lot of need out there in terms of preservation. And I'll touch on that as well. I'll talk a little bit about our process, how things get listed on the Endangered Places list. And then I'm going to pose the question, what have we learned? What have we learned after 25 years of doing this kind of work? And then I'm going to share some lessons that are specifically from Denver, but I want you to understand that I believe preservation is something that works in all communities, in all settings, in small towns, in medium-sized cities, in big urban areas, and so forth. And then at the end, I'm going to leave with hopefully some thought-provoking comments all around the lines. Is all of this work that we've accomplished at risk? Is it all threatened again? And how do we address those things? So hopefully I can touch on all of this and you can walk away with some inspiration for preserving buildings in your community and some ideas on how to proceed. This is some definitional information. Preservation is a direct link to the past, the present, and the future. It is living history. It is economic development, and there's a lot of quantitative information about this, about how it creates jobs and how it benefits our communities. It is community revitalization work. It's also inherently more sustainable than a lot of new types of development. And in a related sense, it's environmentally responsible. The greenest building is one that's already built, one that already exists. The number of resources that go into creating the materials and construction of a new building, in many, many cases, exceeds the cost of rehabilitating an existing historic building. Preservation is also culturally rich. It's a window into the diverse past, and if we open it wide enough, we can hear diverse voices and all the stories, because behind all these great buildings are incredible stories of the people who came here and who built them. Historic preservation is also spatially sensitive. It conserves past and adjacent land uses. So in other words, historic context is important. And generally speaking, preservation pays attention in the restoration of buildings and sites to what's around them as well. A couple more definitional items. In terms of approaches to the preservation of buildings, we use this terminology all the time, but they mean slightly different things. Preservation focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and form as it's evolved over time. Rehabilitation alters or adds to an historic property to meet continuing or new uses while maintaining historic character. And adaptive reuse is an important component of rehabilitation. Restoration depicts a property at a particular time in its history, usually its period of significance, while removing evidence of other periods. If you think about a place like Colonial Williamsburg, that's more of a restoration approach. And the reconstruction recreates vanished or non-surviving portions of the property for interpretive purposes, or uses reproduction through new construction of a resource that no longer exists. Now, we don't do that very often, but in an archaeological sense, sometimes that happens more in places like the Middle East, where they'll take archaeological ruins and then they'll recreate what was there at one time. So that's a little bit of information about the different approaches to preservation. So what's the need for this activity in Colorado? We have a fast growing and changing state. For the purposes of the Endangered Places list alone, we've had nearly 800 properties nominated in 25 years for Colorado's most endangered places list. But that does not include the hundreds of properties that were never nominated or that were lost along the way. We're working a little with the Colorado photographer John Fielder, whose work you may be familiar with. John is a conservationist, and he's very interested in what's happening to the natural environment and the natural world and how it's changing over time. But he's also cognizant that the historic built environment in our state is changing fast. And we are working with him on a book project, and he is interested in this whole question of what is the need. So if you take the Endangered Places list and you take the State and National Register of Historic Places and identify some other resources, there are thousands of properties out here that could potentially be preserved in Colorado. For the Endangered Places list itself, there are 130 sites. 54 of those are considered saved. And the definition of save varies a little bit depending on what the goals were when it was nominated. For a property, for example, that's mainly in a ruined state, the preservation of those ruins and their interpretation might be the definition of save. For other properties, you may want to reconstruct it or rehabilitate it for a new use or whatever. It just kind of depends on what the goals of the community are in nominating. So there's 54 of those saved, and I'll share some of those examples with you today. There's 47 of them in progress, meaning there's active work going on towards a save. And I'm pleased to say there's going to be 3 or 4 really good saves to come up next year to be able to announce. There are 22 properties or sites on alert status. And when a site is listed, it automatically goes on alert status because it's really important in the early days to build on that momentum and that advocacy and that awareness and try to capitalize on that. But sometimes things happen along the way. The champions of the site move away, the resources disappear or whatever, and the site can languish and it can be on the list for a long time. So preservation is often a long-term endeavor. And then we've only lost 7 of these sites in 25 years, which is a pretty good track record, I think. Unfortunately, I think we're about to lose another one, and that might be Denver's 16th Street Mall, but I won't go into that now. It's not going to go away completely, but it's going to be totally rebuilt, and there won't be any historic fabric left, with the exception of the lights, street lights. But we'll see. That may take a while to play out. Because it might be a little hard for you to see this, I'm going to read you this list. These are the things that we're working to preserve in Colorado. Main Street commercial buildings, houses, barns, bridges, ditches, flumes, schools, orchards, wickiups, cultural landscapes, farms and ranches, adobe potato barns, churches and synagogues, opera houses, tourist sites, national monuments, civic places and spaces, depots, trolleys, power plants, homesteads, elevators, hotels, mines and mills, theaters, industrial buildings, fire stations, neon signs, dredges, cemeteries, roadside attractions, and so on and so forth. So 25 years ago, we set out very purposely to save a broad range of Colorado's historic resources, a diversity of resources, as well as examples from all regions of the state. And we worked in 47 counties across Colorado. So what are the goals of the Endangered Places program? Well, obviously, we want to promote historic preservation throughout the state of Colorado. We want to build an awareness that endangered historic sites and the forces that threaten them. And those forces can be many things. They can be natural phenomena, like desertification, global warming maybe, the freeze-thaw cycle in the mountains, which is very hard on buildings. It could be fires, it could be floods, it could be abandonment and neglect. It could be development pressures. There's all these things operating on historic resources in Colorado that potentially threaten them. And then another goal is to provide technical assistance to communities facing these issues, because not everybody knows where to start in preserving their building or their site. And they may not know where the resources are that we can help them find. We also want to provide education on sustainable preservation practices and techniques, and to promote community awareness of historic resources, and provide some volunteer opportunities for people. Each year we do what's called a weekend workshop, where people with any level of volunteer skill can come and work on a historic site under the direction of a preservation architect and other volunteers and contractors. And we haven't picked the site yet this year. Last year we worked on the Lafayette Head Home and Ute Indian Agency in Conejos, Colorado, and we had 35 people show up. We did this workshop with Cornerstones, which is a nonprofit from New Mexico, as well as an outfit called Adobe in Action. And we actually threw mud and worked on repairing Adobe plaster on one of the oldest buildings in Colorado. So this building in this picture is Crossings Market in the tiny town of Yampa up in northwestern Colorado, a community of about 750 people. They managed to raise $1.2 million from 15 different sources to save this quintessential mercantile building. This building was a hardware store in Mercantile. It closed in 1964 and it was vacant until a few years ago. The 1964 calendar was still on the wall at the time, as well as a lot of stuff that's inside. The good news is, today the top part is the town hall, and the lower part is an interpretive museum and a genealogical research station. And they had all this great stuff left over from the hardware store to work with. So that's one of these little success stories. So what happens when a project is nominated to the Endangered Places list? And anybody can nominate it. This is a grassroots process. An organization, an individual, a business, a property owner, whoever can nominate a project. And we kind of gear up in April. The deadline is August 22nd this year. But actually we take them year-round. There's just a bigger push after April. So what happens is when a project is nominated, I make sure that it's fairly complete and have some follow-up questions to be addressed if need be. And then I work very hard to assign an individual reviewer with specialized expertise for this particular nomination. And they will go out and they will do a site visit, and they will interview the stakeholders and the local community advocates and try to get a feel for what the opportunity is, what the challenges are, how much community support exists, and how my organization can help. And then we get together through at least 3 regional review meetings with all these reviewers. This one is from the one in Denver. You can see us all wearing our masks, so you can tell kind of when this was going on. This was the first in-person meeting we were able to do in quite a while. And we hash these out. The reviewer will actually fill out a form and score the nomination, and then we'll talk through these, and certain numbers of them will advance to a statewide meeting that we call Big Monday. And there we'll all come together and we'll haggle over these things and try to figure out which ones to recommend to the Endangered Places Committee of the CPI board for potential listing. And the board will make the final determination based on all of this input. And then we ask the nominations or the selected sites to keep it quiet for a while so we can make a big splash in February at our annual Saving Places Conference. And if you haven't been to the Saving Places Conference, I would highly recommend that you consider coming. It's the largest statewide historic preservation conference in the United States. And we're actually going to take it up to Boulder next year, which is a little bit different. But if you want more information about that, let me know. But at that conference, we announce these new sites. We also unveil short little videos that CBS 4 films that the sites can then use in their own marketing and promotion efforts. And those are also available to look at on our website. But we took a hiatus from this process for 2022, and we decided not to list any new sites, and to concentrate instead on 5 key sites, some of which have a Black, Indigenous, and people of color heritage focus. And these sites include, from top left, Strange's Grocery, which is a remnant of a once thriving Italian-American community in Grand Junction, beautifully built by Italian stonemasons in 1909. And this project has a new owner who's working actively on it. We're very excited about this. There was once about a 4-block area of a very dense Italian-American community in Grand Junction, including 2 or 3 other grocery stores. This is about all that's left. But the downtown area is developing rapidly to the south, and we want to move to try to save this now while we can. The project next to it is the Union Pacific Pump House out in Kit Carson, Colorado, out on the Eastern Plains. It's the only stone pump house on the Union Pacific network, and it was used with a well to pump water for the steam engines. If you've heard recently, UP has brought back Big Boy, the big giant steam engine, and it rolled through Kit Carson, and it rolled through Hugo and some of these other places. And I went to see it, and there were more people there than were actually in the town at the time. So we're hoping to build on this renewed interest in the steam era to try to get Union Pacific, who owns the land, to let us work on this property. The students in the picture are senior engineering students from the University of Colorado, Denver, and they are taking this up as a class project. They're doing a full historic structure analysis on the building and a report, and then hopefully we can use that to convince UP to help us restore it. The project to the right of that is the Iglesia de San Antonio. This is also known as Tiffany Catholic Church, built out of adobe and stucco in 1929 in far La Plata County in southwestern Colorado. It is beautiful on the inside. It's in very rough shape on the outside. And it's part of the Hispano legacy of the settlement of southern Colorado, and in particular, the riverine valleys that are in that area down near Durango. The small property in the top right corner is O.T. Jackson's home at the Deerfield African American Colony, about 20 miles west of Greeley, which was part of the homesteading movement of Black Americans into the West. And they recently just got a $498,000 grant from the African American Civil Rights Heritage Program to begin restoration on the 3 buildings that are left there. There's not much left, unfortunately, and we need to move fast to save them. And then the building on the bottom left is the Southern Ute Indian Boarding School campus. It's the main building on the boarding school campus. It's one of the most intact campuses like that in the United States. And it has this very conflicted and troubling history behind it. And the Southern Ute tribe is trying to determine, can we reuse some of these buildings? And if so, how? And can we also tell the story, and the story of the impact of the boarding school era on indigenous peoples? So these are the sites that we are focusing on, but we're also working with lots of other sites around Colorado. Here are some success stories. The Amachi Japanese American internment site is near Grenada, Colorado, near the Kansas border. Most of it looks like this. It's foundations and overgrown vegetation of a camp where 7,000 people lived during that period when Japanese Americans were relocated primarily from the West Coast to a number of these sites around Colorado. CBI has been involved with this project since 2001, and I'm pleased to announce that we just received a $25,000 grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which has an initiative entitled Telling the Full Story. And it's funded in part through the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities. And the funds will be used to create a documentary about Amache and interview survivors as well. But the top left photo shows one of the barracks that's been preserved, as well as the guard tower and some fencing. And then the property in the top right was a recreation hall at Amache that was being used as a parks maintenance facility in Grenada. And the highway was closed, and the building was driven 3 miles down the highway on a flatbed truck because it was labeled up in the corner, and we knew which foundation it belonged to. And so they were able to repair the foundation and put that back on its original site, and also began to do some interpretation of it. This is another very remarkable success story. The photo on the left shows the condition of the buildings that we often get involved with. These are not easy things to do. These are your basic fixer-uppers. This one was really rough shape in Como, a little mining town in Park County. They have since restored the depot, as well as the roundhouse and the adjacent hotel, and they've laid a mile of railroad track, and you can actually ride on this little track. So this is a great success story for that. Again, tiny little town did this. Speaking of depots, this is in Antonito, the Denver and Rio Grande Antonito depot, vacant for 30 years on the left. That's what it looks like today on the right. This is the one that's a personal labor of love, because I worked for the city of Arvada for 16 years, and it feels like it's taken that long to get this thing saved. It's actually going on 8 or 10 years. But this is Denver Tramway Streetcar number .04. It was part of a system that at one time included 250 miles of track and 150 streetcars. This was the very last streetcar to run in revenue service before they shut the whole system down in 1950. And then a guy named Wally Word and his wife bought this from Jack Forney, who operated the Forney Museum in Denver, because Jack didn't know what to do with it and didn't really have space for it. And it sat for 20 years, wrapped up like a burrito on a storage lot, and continued to deteriorate. But then the city finally got a state historical fund grant, and that's another theme I'll keep coming back to, because that is really the primary source of funding for preservation in Colorado. And they were able to get a grant to restore it, but it's an absolute miracle that it made it up to the shops in Cheyenne where they worked on it. The shops themselves were interesting because they were an old decommissioned nuclear facility. Not the silos that are down in the ground, but the sheds where they open the roof and the missiles would go up, and they would, if they ever had to, fire them out. But the contractor rents space in one of these old Cold War era buildings and worked, and that's what it looks like on the right today. And it's going to be displayed in Old Town Arvada later this year. And it's a miracle it made up there. It truly is. It involved a lot of deconstruction too, just to figure out what was left and how to rebuild it. This is Evans School, also vacant for nearly 30 years. And today there are offices, and the beautiful entry lobby and stairwell is maintained. And they have a great farmers market in late spring and summer here inside that fence for the Golden Triangle neighborhood. This is one not far from here, the Goodnight Barn, the legacy of Charles Goodnight in Pueblo. It didn't look so good up in the top left-hand corner, but, and actually, the folks at Texas A&M University wanted to dismantle the barn and move it there, because they have some kind of a Goodnight Heritage Center there. And that prompted the people of Pueblo to say, no, that's not happening. But it took a long time to get it saved and preserved, and they're just now getting it ready for public use. In fact, I think they're having a big national chuck wagon kickoff, chili kickoff coming up in about a month. And that's what it looks like today on the inside. Here's another success story, the Hugo Roundhouse, one of the brick roundhouses on the Union Pacific system. And that's what it looked like on the left. This is another one that I really love. If you go to the McCollum Creek Flume on Highway 160 near Cortez, Colorado, there's actually an interpretive stop that you can get out and you can look at. And when you do, you're looking down on it like that. But I wanted to get a better picture of it. So I decided to climb down the creek bed, and I got about halfway down there and jumped on a ledge a little bit, and then pitched forward and rolled down the rest of the way. Covered in dirt, but kind of lost my breath for a moment, and then laughed about it, and then took my pictures. I wanted to see what it looked like, sort of from the underbelly of it. It's an incredible engineering achievement, and it's the way they brought water to the town of Cortez. And it's the only surviving remnant on the entire ditch system down there. This one you folks probably know a lot about. I personally don't know a lot about this history associated with this, but it's turned out beautifully, and it's endured other challenges, as has the community along the way, floods and things like that. Here's one in Denver. This wonderful city, beautiful era gateway monument called Sullivan Gateway. It includes statuary and fountains and a long border wall of stone. And it was in really wrecked shape. And now the water has been restored, and it's beautiful. And by the way, in sharing these success stories, I want to emphasize that CPI did not save all these projects by ourselves. It takes local resources, it takes cooperation, collaboration. It takes a lot of people working on these things to make them happen. And when the rubber hits the road, it's really in the local community where it happens. But we do everything we can to help. So, after doing this work for 25 years, what have we really learned from it? What have we learned from historic preservation? Well, preservation is about saving significant buildings, landscapes, and places. That's pretty obvious. It's not about freezing a place in time. It's really about preserving aspects of the past that we live with today that teach us about the past and offer lessons for the future. Preservation is about environmental conservation, the protection of resources, and the partnerships that entails. Because some of these sites are on parkland or in open space parcels and in natural areas. And sometimes there are funding sources and partnerships there that can help. Preservation is about heritage, tourism, and bringing public history alive. And you do that every day here in this wonderful building. Preservation creates jobs. It has a significant economic impact. And it helps sustain skilled building trades and craft traditions in our state. And back to the State Historical Fund. The State Historical Fund is a program of History Colorado, the state historical agency. We're not the state agency, we're a private nonprofit. The State Historical Fund is capitalized by funds from gaming and the 3 mountain gaming communities. And then there's a pool of funding that communities can compete for preservation grants. That program is also more than 25 years old, and that program has probably done more than anything to preserve these skilled trade and crafts traditions that otherwise often go away because they're not necessarily used in new construction anymore. And preservation is about retaining community, ethnic, and cultural identities. And in a related way, it's about saving the diverse cultural legacies, stories, and history. And again, behind every great building or site, there are great stories about amazing people. Preservation is about placemaking. As our CPI tagline says, building a future with historic places. Preservation is about the process of managing change in a more thoughtful, sustainable way. It's about managing the difficult balance between revitalization and gentrification. And having done this work in a lot of different settings, we kind of know how to go about revitalizing the place. I worked for the Kansas Main Street program in 21 small towns and communities. I worked as the director of the Lower Downtown District when Coors Field was built. I worked for Historic Denver for 5 years, and I've worked now for CPI for 5 years, and I also worked in local government. And we know how to go about revitalizing a commercial district or a neighborhood. But what we don't know really well is how to manage change when the forces of development really start to impact a place. And I'm going to talk about that here some more in a moment. Preservation, of course, is about partnerships, perseverance, and perspectives, and harnessing those diverse perspectives for positive change. Here's some lessons that I think we've learned from Denver. Back in 1991, there were 41 vacant historic mid-rise buildings in downtown Denver. I'm not talking about Larimer Square, I'm not talking about Lower Downtown. I'm talking about the Central Business District. 41 buildings that looked like these. You know, the Jocelyn Durega store, the Boston building, the Burger Brothers building, and so on and so forth. By 2001, all but 2 of these buildings were fully rehabilitated and in use. And most of this was market-driven because developers all of a sudden realized, hey, these buildings are cool. There's a demand for them. People want to live in them. They want to work in them. And what happened was the lessons of Larimer Square and Dana Crawford's work there, and in Lower Downtown, where many people basically march uptown through the Central Business District and inspire positive preservation change. But, and then it was codified, actually. And this is a brilliant step. My former boss, Kathleen Brucker, who later became the director of Historic Seattle, came up with this idea of a downtown Denver historic district, which would include 43 protected buildings. This is really unique because it's a non-contiguous district. Usually, a district is very tightly contained and all the buildings on one block are contributing buildings. This is a little different approach. This is what it looks like from above. And you can see it kind of jogs around in different areas. But those buildings are all protected now in Denver. The one that got demolished, the city and county of Denver told the developer, you will not demolish this building for a parking lot. They went ahead and did it anyway. And it's still empty to this day. And the company is still sitting on it. And what a waste of opportunity. I mean, when you tear down a building, you just eliminate options in many cases. And that's what happened. But most of these have been restored. But, are they really protected? Is all this work at risk? And I believe it is, increasingly. This is a sign from Seattle that showed up all over the community. My son is an architect in Seattle, and I visit him quite frequently. And it's just unbelievable what's going on there. And the same thing is playing out in Denver and other cities. And I really think there are is crime and addiction and social disorder. And I've watched this play out right outside my door at work in the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm very concerned about it. I work in the Emerson School building, it's the 3rd oldest school building in Denver. And there are a number of nonprofits there. And for many, many days, I've been the only one in there until people finally started coming back to work. But what's happening out on the street is very alarming. And I'll share some of that with you. Just a little note about gentrification. Gentrification in and of itself is not bad. Neighborhoods need new investment. And they change over time. And they need to change to accommodate new groups of people. You know, it's bad public policy to concentrate all poor people in one area of the city, because then poverty is just perpetuated over time. So gentrification is needed, but that's a little bit different than what I call development-induced displacement. And these examples here are not necessarily bad examples. These are 2 different photographs. If you look, the houses on the left are obviously new houses. They probably replaced something that looked a lot like the houses on the right. And you can probably bet that the folks living in the houses on the left maybe have a little higher incomes than the long-term residents that are living on the right, maybe. But, and in terms of scale or proportion, this is not really a bad example necessarily. And again, it's also good to have diverse incomes in the neighborhood. But the pressures that the more egregious examples of this are putting on neighborhoods are driving out long-term residents in some cases. And then I mentioned crime, addiction, and social disorder. This is what's going on right outside my office. These fellows out here are maybe 5 or 6 people out of maybe 30 or more that are there every day, 3 times a day. The drugs come in, they flock, they buy them, they distribute them, they get arrested. In the last 3 months, there have been 94 arrests on my half block at work. Folks are being released right away, including people with weapons violations that are back on the street the next day, and it just keeps happening. The streets are being flooded with meth, heroin, crack cocaine, fentanyl, opiates. And I really think that this is part of what's driving the epidemic of homelessness. You know, it makes it sound like we're blaming the victims if we say that homelessness is being driven by addiction. But it is a serious problem in this country, in our communities, and not just in the cities. And I'm very concerned about it. You know, people lose their homes for a variety of reasons. They may lose their job, they may suffer catastrophic illness for whatever reason. But oftentimes in that case, they have some kind of a support network, maybe a friend where they can stay with for a few days, or an extended family, or whatever. But people that are addicted are the folks, in many ways, that are living in tents and living out in the open on the streets. And the problem is getting worse. I watched this as it's happened over time. And, you know, the bottom line is that people don't feel safe and secure. They will abandon even the most successful downtowns and neighborhoods. And last year, for the first time in 20 years, Denver actually had a net out-migration of population of over 6,000 people. I think there's some evidence that it's turning around a little bit. But, you know, Capitol Hill emptied out in the 60s and 70s. And then it came back and was vigorous and safe and thriving. And now it's in danger of tilting in the other way. And I believe this kind of stuff endangers the work of community building and preservation. And I don't have a lot of answers about this. In Union Station, there have been almost 900 arrests in the last year or so for these kinds of problems. This is what I call offensive urbanism. People piling up boulders on the right of way to keep people from people sleeping and pitching their tents there. There are streets in Denver where there's a whole block of that going on. So there's definitely problems out there that are affecting the community, people that are victims of it, and the quality of life in the community. And then another thread I just want to touch on before I wrap up is globalization has transformed our cities in ways that we can hardly imagine. There is tons of money flowing into our cities to build projects, and we don't even know where some of this money is coming from, frankly. With a limited liability company, you can hide the sources of funding, and it may be coming from Russia for all we know. And not all is bad, but this is the block near where I work, and by the way, there are 2 face blocks now that look like this, where they've erased the entire frontage on Colfax. And they're going to build something new, and it's going to be very big. And maybe it will transform the neighborhood, I don't know. This is an example in Old Town, Nevada. This is an example where you can actually have design review in place to protect historic properties, and the process gets captured by powerful interests who then twist it to their own needs and build projects like this next to Arvada's first neighbor's home. They just dwarf the project. And then this is really what we call overscale commodity-driven development. Notice the difference between the historic row houses here and the building back behind it. Same here. And notice the shadows they cast on the street, because across the street is a building just as big as this. And there's a time and a place for this kind of development, and we certainly need new housing. But I think it's getting to the point where it's really challenging. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some differences. Denver has 54 historic districts, but that's only 18% of the land area of the city and county of Denver. Those districts, though, have protection, and those are the places where this kind of thing is not happening. This is happening in historic areas all around these, but not in the historic districts that have design review and some protection. And by the way, historic areas already have 78% of the density that exists in a typical city. The historic neighborhoods are already more diverse, dense than other neighborhoods. If density is the goal, and I think it is, we can't just constantly build outward. That will happen anyway of its own initiative. But if density is a goal, I think it should be shared more equitably and not sacrifice our historic neighborhoods to accommodate all. So, I don't know what the solutions to all this are. There's a lot to celebrate here, so I don't want to end on a really negative note. But I think it gets back to grassroots, community-driven efforts. It's what saves these buildings and what helps us retain the character of our communities. This is a photo from the town of New Raymer, Colorado, a town that has about 100 people in it. I think about half of them showed up to help clean out the old Star Texaco gas station, get their hands dirty and do some hands-on preservation work. So I think it comes back to people, it comes back to community, it comes back to grassroots efforts to save these places. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of this with you, and I'd be glad to answer some questions, or maybe we'll invite Tim Waddington, and then we'll answer some questions.
Okay, well, Tim, you want to come over to this? So the title of our program was State and Local Perspective. So we are thrilled to welcome the Historic Preservation Alliance of Colorado Springs. Their mission is to provide leadership and inspiration to preserve, protect, and promote Colorado Springs heritage and historic neighborhoods for today accomplish this important mission through advocacy, education, events, and strategic alliances. I am thrilled to welcome William Tim Bobbington. He's a native of Colorado Springs. He grew up on the Old North End, attended Fountain Valley School for Boys and Colorado College. He retired from Bobbington Lumber Company and now enjoys his retirement. Tim has served on the HPA Board of Directors for many years in a variety of capacities and is currently the board president. Will you join me in welcoming Tim Bobbington?
You should be noted that Fountain Valley is council win, so just to be sure. So thank you very much, and Kim, thank you very much. We are in a wonderful building that is a success story for Colorado Springs, and we have many projects that we all think are moving in the right direction, but we have many challenges. And so the Historic Preservation Alliance, now in our 23rd year, is doing wonderful things. And shoot, I forgot to bring up the little brochure that, we're getting ready to do our 4th annual High Street Preservation Forum. So we have it out there on the desk outside, but it's going to be May 6th, and it's going to be a virtual event. So you'll be able to attend online. All you need to do is register. But this will give you some background in what we're currently doing in Colorado Springs and how we hope to be able to continue the trend of success stories, although, as Kim noted, there are so many challenges to making that success ongoing and sustainable. Certainly one of the best things that could happen in Colorado Springs is for you all to participate on that grassroots level, encourage your elected officials to put a preservation planner on board at the city. There is no preservation planner. We used to have one. We lost him in 2008 during the recession. But a preservation planner would help all of our neighborhoods. We're advocating for organizing themselves, getting an overlay in place perhaps, but it takes some public-private work to be a successful effort. And right now, we have the effort from the citizens. We go into the city and we find that the people who are knowledgeable in how to get this done don't exist. And so our Historic Preservation Board is sort of, their hands are tied, they're not well trained, and they would love to do the job, but they don't have the support from planning. Planning is all about retool. All they want to do is finish that project, get it before council, and then wait and see what happens. But you're going to find that Historic Preservation has people here that care, and so that's what we're all about with the Historic Preservation Alliance. We're an all-volunteer organization. We meet monthly as a board, but we create many events that are designed to help educate and promote and advocate preservation in our community. And many of you, I see, have come to our tours and our preservation events that include our winter lecture series that has been a beautifully restored Jewett home, now the Peel House by the First Lutheran Church up on North Cascade, an incredible restoration project that raised over $3 million, just spectacular. We're also advocating for the Union Printers Home, and we've got a local family and their tremendous enthusiasm to really risk it all, putting it out there. It's going to be a huge project, but to preserve that incredible, one-of-a-kind facility in this country. There's nothing like it, and it's in our backyard. So we're also working with the City Auditorium, which is another major restoration project that has many working parts to it right now. But preservation is a big part of its budget, and it has to be done right, and they're doing their part to make sure that they include the voices of the preservationists here in this room to make it a good project. So anyway, my final pitch to you is just to let you know that the Historic Preservation Alliance exists, that we're welcoming you to join our organization and encouraging you to recognize that our website, hbasprings.org, is a great resource for finding out what we're doing, what we're offering in terms of education and tours and fun things And so we try to make that part of what we do. So thank you very